Okay, so, sorry, just to introduce you, Lorna Siggins, and of course, Mensun Bound. So I'll hand it over to you, Lorna.
Yeah, great. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, great. Great to see such a wonderful audience here. You can hear me at the back, yeah? So, I don't really think I need to read Mensun CV. I have a feeling you all know about it, but just to go back to about 3 o'clock on March the 5th, 1922, the managers of whaling stations in South Georgia and about 100 men gathered at the island's Lutheran church for about half an hour to bury Ernest Shackleton. He had died 2 months before that at a young age, and 100 years later, almost to the hour, the Endurance, the location of the Endurance was confirmed 3 miles down in Antarctica. And I'm delighted to welcome Mensun Bound here to speak about how all that came about and the enormous effort that was involved. And I'd also like to welcome Mensun's wife, an accomplished diver, Jo Yellowlees Bound as well, who's here today. So Mensun Bound has discovered many of the world's best known shipwrecks, and many artefacts he recovered are on exhibition in over a dozen museums around the world. And the Discovery Channel nicknamed him the Indiana Jones of the Deep. It had commissioned a 4-part series on his work entitled Lost Ships, which I'm sure some of you have seen. He began his career in underwater archaeology in Turkey with the Institute of Nautical Archaeology. He founded the first academic unit for maritime archaeology in England, and from 1992 to 2013 he was the Triton Fellow in Maritime Archaeology at St Peter's College, Oxford University. Among his many expeditions have been the location of the Campis Bay wreck off Giglio in Italy, which filled vital knowledge gaps on the Etruscan trade around 600 BC, recovery of intact porcelain from the Hoi An ship, which was wrecked in the South China Sea in the mid-15th century. He surveyed Lord Nelson's Agamemnon. He's located the First World War German wreck of the Scharnhorst off the Falklands. He was involved in several expeditions to the battle cruiser Admiral Graf Spee, a symbol of German might, which was scuttled off Uruguay in 1939. And he comes from the Falklands, which he will talk about. He's been a Shackleton enthusiast from a very young age, and there's also actually a family link, which he will also talk about, with Shackleton and Tom Crean and Frank Worsley, who had made several visits to the Falklands. So welcome again to Mensun. Mensun, this all started over a cup of coffee.
It did. Yeah, 10 years ago, last August, I was with a close friend of mine, a man who's absolutely passionate about the sea, and we were meeting at Cafe Nero in South Ken. In fact, the very first Cafe Nero ever on the old Brompton Road, and I'd just been asked a few weeks before by one of the museums in London that were mounting an exhibition on Scott and his life and achievements. This was, would be 2012, the centenary of Scott's death. And I had a call from them asking if I could find the Terra Nova, as they wanted to make that the focus of the exhibition. It was at the Natural History Museum. And I said, yeah, give me the right equipment, and give me a week, I will find the Terra Nova, because I actually had an excellent set of coordinates for it. And we were in Cafe Nero, just got in, and he was holding the table to one side while I was over at the counter getting the coffees. And I was leafing through that day's complimentary copy of the Times, and there on page 7 there was an article, not very long, about 6 or 7 inches long, but the headline was, Terra Nova found. And I was just completely devastated. My friend later said that my face went absolutely ashen, and he asked what was wrong, and I showed him the article, and he said, well, what about the Endurance? That was the moment of inception. But the grand irony is that I tried to talk him out of it. It said, it's in deep water beneath the perennial pack of the Weddell Sea. The technology's not ready for it. I had all sorts of excuses already. But he's the kind of guy who loves a challenge, and he, as I said, he's passionate about the sea. And he was putting together an amazing company called Ocean Infinity at the time. And it took quite a long time, but he assembled the search equipment, and it's not a matter of the search vehicles, it's a matter also of having the technicians who can operate them. By that I mean not just the pilots, but also the engineers, the hardware engineers, the software engineers, the data analysts, and then you've got to have doubles of everything, because when you're putting equipment like that in the sea, you can't afford to stop. You've got to run a 24-hour operation, so you've got to have doubles of everybody. And eventually it got to a stage where it was several years later, he and his wife and I and my wife were eating together at a restaurant in the Cotswolds, and at the end of the meal he said to me, the time is right, we're ready to search, to go out there and try and find the Endurance. And he tasked me with finding the wreck, and tasked a friend of mine, a very old dear friend of mine called John Kingsford, who's an old diver. I've known him for decades, we've worked together on different things. And John is CEO of a company called DOS, Deep Ocean Search. So John was brought on board. John spent his time trying to find the right icebreaker to get us into the pack and assemble the hardware and stuff like that. And then went from there. A committee was formed of about 5 or 6 of us. The great John Shears was there, but also the chairman of the Falklands Maritime Heritage Trust, and I'll come back to them if I can. Don Lamont was there, and who were the others? There were about 5 or 6 others, I would guess. And that was sort of the kernel. Those are the guys at the centre of things. And it just went from there.
Right. And of course, it wasn't easy, but you had so much experience at that time, 40 years of experience. How did you get involved in maritime archaeology in the first place?
Serendipity has always played a large part in my life. And this goes back to 1980, 79, 80, something like that, when I was a student at Oxford. My wife and I were working on the Mary Rose together, and we met the man who discovered the Mary Rose, a man called Alexander McKee. And Joe and I were with Alexander one day at his home on Hayling Island, and he was a writer. He used to produce sort of potted histories once a year for Souvenir Press. And he took us into his writing room, and it was completely lined with books. All walls were just shelves up to the ceiling, except for the uppermost shelf. And along those shelves, he had like a string of little bibelots, little bits and pieces which he'd found during his life as a diver. And there's one piece there that jumped out at me. And I said to Alex, where did that piece up there come from? And he sort of paused, and he said, well, Mensun, of all the pieces up there, why did you select that one? And so I told him, I said that it was Etruscan. I could tell that from the shape. I knew that it dated to about 600 BC, give or take 20 years. I knew that it come from underwater because it was covered in marine deposits. And I said if that piece came from a shipwreck, that would be the oldest shipwreck ever found from the post-Bronze Age period. And therefore, it had to be of potentially outstanding archaeological significance. So he told me this incredible story about how 20 years before, 1961, he'd been on this little island called Giglio off the coast of Tuscany, which I'd never heard of before. Nobody probably else has here either, unless you remember that tour ship that went down there about 6 years ago. So I went to meet Reg Valentine, who'd found the wreck, and he showed me some old photographs, snapshots. And it was at that moment I realized I'd blundered into a wreck of really outstanding importance. And my wife and I, and a huge team from Oxford University and elsewhere, we spent 4 years excavating that shipwreck. And it was a great success. At the end of that time, we had a huge exhibition in the National Archaeological Museum in Florence. And you've got to remember, I'm barely touching 30 at that time, the exhibition in Florence. And these days, if you want to see the Giglio ship material, you go to the Underwater Museum of Italy, and the entire top floor is all Giglio ship. And at that point, my career just kind of exploded, and for the next 32 years, I never stopped. It was excavating, evaluating, surveying shipwrecks all over the world. But that's how it started.
Okay. And of course, the Falkland Islands link as well. I mean, you're obviously well used to being on the water.
Yeah, I mean, it is indeed from the Falklands that I derive my interest and enthusiasm for ships. I grew up on New Island, and I know there are people here that know New Island. Back in the 50s here we had working schooners there, a bit like the island. Same generation, same shape pretty much too. And I worked on those, and it was pretty scary. I was an 8 or 9 year old, and you had 3 or 4 of the crew there, and invariably, by the end of the day, they were paralytically drunk in the skippers, in the scuppers, and there I am, sort of in charge of a schooner or a ketch or something like that. And that's where it began. And then in Port Stanley, of course, we were, because we're not now, we were the finest outdoor museum of 19th century nautical antiquity in the world. You throw open your curtains in the morning, there you saw these great hulked old Cape Horners in the 19th century, which had sort of tried to get around Cape Horn in the face of the implacable westerlies, and trying to find that slant sort of beating to windward. You can just picture it, these ships sort of heeled over in the trades, gushing white water from the scuppers, and most of them made it, but many didn't. 2-3 months trying to find that slant. That's what beat down men and ships. And what happened was they'd turn and run before the wind for Port Stanley, where many of them were then condemned as unseaworthy, and there they stayed. And I used to clamber over those ships as a kid with my dad. Great Britain, SS Great Britain, that was there in the Falkland Islands. I used to go duck egging with my father in the Great Britain. I don't know why we never found any duck eggs, but that's all we did.
So back to the endurance, and as you, and I know you're all aware of it, but I'm just going to plug this wonderful read. So as you recount in your book, which is just published, there were 2 expeditions, and the 2019 expedition, it was
pretty disastrous, you're trying to say? Yeah, we didn't do well. But on the other hand, mistakes and errors and things we learned in the 2019 expedition made possible the success of this year. So, all that wonderful team we had in 2019, we owe them so much. And we did make the same mistakes twice. We learned a lot from 2019. I think in terms of equipment, certainly, but also in terms of attitude. I was pretty arrogant about things when we burst into the pack for the first time. I sort of liken it to these paintings you get of Renaissance condottieri, sort of storming in horseback. It was like us, beating into the pack, and in the end, the ice just completely beat us. And when we left, I was, sackcloth and ashes. I was just totally horsewhipped, and it was terrible. I'd lost a piece of kit, worth millions, and going back to the head office in London wasn't a great moment in my life. I tell the story, I used to think that the guy who conceived this whole project, he'd probably hand me a pistol with a single bullet and spout and send me off to the library to do the honourable thing. But in fact, he didn't. He just said, his words were, "Don't worry, Mensun, we're not giving up." And at that moment myself, and the words of an American friend of mine who was on the team, he said, we were in with the second chance of a lifetime. Getting back to the attitude problem thing, that's interesting, because I can't speak for my colleagues, in particular for John Shears, the expedition leader, but I certainly had this thing about trying to impose our will on the ice, and that didn't work, and we learned a lesson there. So when we went in next time round, we let the ice, so to speak, impose its will on us, and that worked, because we weren't fighting the ice anymore, we were working with it.
And you have a passage in the book you might like to read about that? Or...
Indeed.
Yeah, it's just there.
I got to apologise. You probably noticed I speak in monotone, and the best reader. I should have been an octopus. So here we are. Oh yeah, I should, but yeah, a bit of background. Yeah, it wasn't a great moment. This is when we lost AUV 7. I should explain, our principal search vehicle in 2019 was what we call an autonomous underwater vehicle, AUV, and this one was number 7. And they're great bits of kit, they really are, but probably not for under ice work. And what we do is we program them to follow a prescribed path underwater, and then they sort of toggle off, and then we meet with them on this occasion it was every 68 to 8 hours for what we call a handshake, or a rendezvous if you like, and we interrogate the various payload systems of the AUV and check them all out, then we issue them with sometimes fresh navigational instructions, then they go back into autonomous mode, and we have no control over them again until we meet up the next time. And we had actually covered half of the search box. We were doing very, very well indeed. And the mood on the ship was absolutely euphoric. Everybody was convinced we were going to complete the mission. I wasn't totally convinced the ship was going to be in the search area, but everybody else seemed to think that. And the mood on the ship was just brilliant. And we divided the search box up into 11 notional lines, and we're on line 7, so we were well over halfway through. And so where do I pick up? So normally I'd go down for the handshakes, but even I was so confident that we were going to complete the mission that I didn't on this occasion. I went for dinner. And so here we are. I just finished eating and was walking down the stairwell to the ops room when I ran into Todd Osner coming up 2 steps at a time to find me. Todd is probably the most placid guy on this ship, and if anything ruffles him, he never lets it show. But at that moment, he had a face on him like a slapped bum. Even before he opened his mouth, I felt a chill run through me. "It's missed its rendezvous," was all he said. No more was needed. There was only one flight between the mess deck and the science deck, and together we ran down those steps like a couple of pelted hens. Claire Samuel was already there, her face was drained. Devon, Espen and Blake were also there, standing but bent forward towards the screens and looking stony. Behind them, peering over their shoulder, was the data analyst Pierre Lagal, glasses up on his forehead and mouth agape in disbelief. My old friend Chad was seated at the center in front of the main screen. He wasn't smiling. Chad's always smiling. He looked up. "Seven's gone AWOL," was all he said. Suddenly the door slammed open with such force that the screens flickered. Channing, the AUV team leader, stormed in. "Right?" he snapped out. "From now on I want every detailed log, because if it doesn't turn up in the next few minutes, there will be an inquiry." It was the beginning of a very long, very tense evening. And then I paused for a bit. We are now locked within the hard crust of the most deranged sea on Earth, a world of ice without end. Temperatures are plummeting, the ship is struggling, and the pack is tightening. Winter is no longer on its way. It's here. What a time and what a place for our world to implode. And then we spent 2 to 3 days, just literally crashing about within the pack, trying to establish contact with the lost AUV, because it does have a beacon system, and if we could pick up the pulse it was emitting, then at least we'd know where it is. And it was getting more and more dangerous. The ice was getting more and more aggressive. The pressure was building. The winter was really on top of us, and it was getting. The skipper was really starting to get worried and letting it show. So I'm just going to read this last couple of paragraphs. So we got to the stage where we just kind of knew that we couldn't go on anymore. We really were pretty much beaten. So this is like 2.5, 3 days later. By late afternoon, the ship was free. Yeah, that's right. We'd actually been, we were several times, a bit like the Endurance, locked in the ice. And there was one day there, I think we were locked for 3 days, where we did sort of kind of wonder if, if like the Endurance are going to end up on the wrong side of history. Anyway, by late afternoon, the ship was free, but we were struggling to cope. In an hour and a half, we'd made only a single kilometre. Before we knew it, we were approaching evening when temperatures would plummet and the water would further harden about us. There was nothing left to say. We were all drained and we were all out of ideas. And although nobody said it, out of hope, there was a clear sense that we were on the edge. On the bridge, Captain Knowledge Bengo, our amazing master, beckoned to Freddie, who was the ice skipper, and for a while the two conferred privately over on the starboard wing. The rest of us knew what it was about. There was a decision to be made, and it was stark. Should we pursue the search for another 24 hours, or should we leave now? Our chances of finding AUV-7 were negligible, and Knowledge's first thought had to be for the safety of the ship. I watched their mouths move, but I couldn't hear what they were saying. As we waited, I looked out over the ice. On the edge of a floe a little to the south, the penguins stood alone. I remembered reading when they abandoned the Endurance, some emperor penguins waddled over, raised their beaks, and chanted a weird dirge. I took that piece, I think, from Hussey's book. And then the captain came over to deliver his decision. And so it was that everything came to an end. It wasn't quite as dramatic as I predicted yesterday. Nobody remonstrated. In fact, nobody said anything. We all just stood there, arms akimbo, alone with our thoughts, either studying the deck or gazing out over the ice into the white distance. Simply put, we had run out of road. There was a similar moment in the battle to save the Endurance when everybody knew they couldn't do no more. For 2 days they'd manned the pumps but were unable to beat back the rising water within the ship. All night they'd been pumping and were utterly exhausted. Maitland wrote in his diary, "I don't remember anyone telling us to stop, but we just seemed to understand that we might as well give up." The Agulhas, that's the ship we're on, was brought about, and under an implausibly streaky sky, we began our retreat. "Time to get out of here," said the mate. For a few minutes away from the others, John and I talked through all that had to be done next. He had the unenviable task of writing to the project's management committee and the trustees of the Flotilla Foundation. I then went to my cabin, as I also had some difficult calls to make, starting with the head office in London. On our way, I passed through the lounge. All the ROV guys were there, plus some of the AUV team, both data analysts, a couple of scientists, and several students. I paused, feeling I ought to say something. They all looked towards me and, doleful-eyed, like the executioner about to raise his axe, I looked back at them. This was not the punchline of which I had dreamed. The words seemed to stick in my throat, but I got behind them, gave a push, and out they came. "Gentlemen," I said, "it's over."
Thank you. You put a lot of faith in, and you probably didn't doubt the dead reckoning and navigational abilities of Captain Frank Worsley and others to determine the likely location of it. What had convinced you of their accuracy, of that reading?
Yeah, it's a very big question. All we had to go on to start with was Worsley's coordinates. And the first question I had, after that dinner in the Cotswolds, the first thing I did was then bury myself in the archives for ages. And one of the first questions I had was really, how good a navigator was Worsley, really? I mean, we all say what a brilliant navigator he was, but, it was... pretty much received wisdom. Maybe he wasn't such a brilliant navigator, in which case I was really in trouble with those coordinates. And so I looked for evidence, to really demonstrate that he was such a great navigator. Because you look at the drift chart, and one way or the other, it could be made by anybody with a sextant. How accurate was it? You just didn't know. But then as you go through the story, the whole Shackleton saga, then things jump out at you and you realize, oh my God, this guy really was good. The first instance was really when they left the ice on the 9th of April. And he himself said it was the very worst moment of the whole expedition. where they'd been buffeted back by the sea, there'd been night time, and they really didn't know, how much progress they'd made to the west. And he came up with this, they got this glimpse through the clouds. There was a chink in the clouds, and it was just enough for him to grab a snap on the sun. And but he wasn't that confident, and so he and Shackleton conferred on what to do, because they were way off track, and not only had they not made any progress, they were about, I don't know, it was 20-30 miles down from where he thought they should be. He was badly worried about this situation, because he had then to determine a course for Elephant Island. And of course, if you're setting a course from somewhere, you've got to start by knowing where you are, right? He wasn't 100% sure about those coordinates he took. But guess what? He was spot on. And if he got them wrong, they would have missed Elephant Island, and they would have perished, because, what is there beyond Elephant Island, right? Nothing. And then they headed for Elephant Island, and lo and behold, Elephant and Clarence, appeared a couple of days later, not off to one side or the other, but bang in front of them. That was quite incredible. And I don't need anybody to tell anybody in this audience about how brilliant that navigation was to South Georgia. I mean, we all know that story inside out. But again, you see, South Georgia, it wasn't like, South Georgia's a high island, it's hard to miss, if the truth be known. But the fact is, it was bang in front of him. And he only had 4 fixes, as I recall, during that 2-week journey. I mean, that was incredible. And then later on, I discovered another incident. It was when they were heading down in the Emma out of Punta Arenas to try and save the men. Again, you see, they had to cross the Drake Passage, and they made landfall. They made Elephant Island. They could see it. And again, it wasn't way off the port or starboard, bang in front of him. You might say the first time, maybe he was lucky. Second time, maybe lucky. Third, fourth, no, he was a brilliant navigator. So then I went back to his coordinates with a lot of respect. But then I found out very soon that, guess what? They were not an observed position. I assumed, I think most people assumed, that his coordinates for the sinking were taken by a sextant. No, they were an estimated position. The position he had, what he's working from, was he hadn't been able to get a fix on the sun for 3 days before because of weather conditions, and he wasn't able to get a fix on the sun until a day after the ship sank. And even then, you got to remember, he wasn't actually on the spot. He was 1.5 miles off to the northwest it was. But what he did was he applied what we call an offset to that position on the 22nd, by which I mean he took an educated guess at how far the ice had gone, how fast it was moving, what direction it was going, and he applied that. And that's how he got his fix. Now, to jump to the end point here, when we found the wreck, it was only just over 4 nautical miles from where he said it was, to the south, which, any way you look at it, is pretty incredible.
It really is. And you were out walking on the ice with John Shears. When?
Yeah, absolutely so. Yeah, it was. John and I had been talking for a couple of days about stretching our legs, and that morning, 5th of March, the day we found the wreck, and I pulled back my curtains. I had a wonderful set of rooms that looked out to the front of the ship, but also out to the starboard side. There was this iceberg locked within the floe within which we were locked. And I thought, that this is the time to do the iceberg, because things were getting quite stressy on the wreck. We'd had some really bad weather. But we were into that kind of little Indian summer type period of 2 days, but we knew that was going to end. We knew when that Indian summer ended, the project would end with it, because when the weather came back, it would come back with a vengeance. We were just hanging on by our fingertips. So, John and I were on the bridge, and we decided we'd go for it. It was only about 1.5 kilometers, 2 kilometers away, something like that. So it would have been about, I'm guessing about, let's say 3:30 in the afternoon. He and I kitted up, we layered up, and off we set. And I had switched channels on the radio, so when they were trying to get hold of us, they hadn't realized that I was on a different channel. And so, how did it go? It would have been 4:05 in the afternoon. This anomaly suddenly appeared on the data screen where you have the acoustic data sort of cascading down a screen in the ops room at the stern of the ship. And it was absolutely clear, you know, it was, the signature was just perfect. And, you know, it was kind of obviously man-made. I mean, it might have been drop stones, but it was really unlikely. It could have been a dead whale, but nah. You know, it was the wreck, and the only man-made thing in the middle of the Weddell Sea is the Endurance, right? Those guys had no doubt it was the Endurance. So, you know, there were John, you know, we were out on the ice, we had no notion of what was happening on the ship. And we came back on board, and I was absolutely frozen and just wanted to warm up, and I was getting out of my polar gear. And one of the cadets came up to me, and he said to me, you know, the master asked me to convey his compliments and request your presence on the bridge immediately. Fine, but just as he finished saying to that, the tannoy system crackled to life, and it was shears and bound and shears, to the bridge immediately, you know, loud voice throughout the ship. John and I looked at each other. We'd never been spoken to like that before. Anyway, we raced up the bridge, and I was fearing the worst because I had very raw, very visceral, very vivid memories of 3 years before we lost the AUV, and you know, and my first thought was, oh no, please God, not again. You know, I just, you know, I can't go through this twice. You know, it's like an old Bob Dylan song. You know, what price you have to pay not to go through things twice. You know, it was like that. But then, you know, I just looked up and I caught one of the French data analysts standing in the doorway there, and he had this really exaggerated grin on his face. And you know, if we just lost a vehicle, there's no way he'd be grinning like that. And then I could see through the glass partition into the ops room. There was a guy called Jim who was laughing. So at that moment, I knew something good was on the way. And yeah, I was thinking, oh dear, I think it, you know. And we tumbled out onto the bridge. And Nico Vincent, I got to pause for a second here. We had some amazing people working with us over the years. I got to pay tribute to them. In 2019, we had this Top Gun guy from the American Navy called Channing Thomas. He was the head of the AUV team, brilliant guy. We had a lady called Claire Samuel, she was in charge of the back deck. The back deck this year was JC Kaivan, but the guy who was in charge of everything to do with subsea, both above and below water, was Nico Vincent, underwater engineer from the south of France, who oversaw the production of our vehicle. He did everything, basically. But anyway, he suddenly strode up to me, and he thrust his iPhone right into my face, and he said, "Gents, let me introduce you to the Endurance." And he had this high-frequency sonar image of the Endurance on his phone, as if seen from above, and it was absolutely perfect, absolutely exquisite in its detail. It was just, you know, it couldn't be more perfect. And to anticipate your next question, Lorna, because everybody asks themselves, you know, how did I feel? And the truth of the matter is, at that moment, I really, you know, it was so utterly explosive. You know, I was totally intoxicated, if you like, by this undiluted joy. You know, just I don't really remember everything just seemed to fracture in my head at that moment. You know, this was 10 years in the making, and you know, finding the Endurance was just. But I do remember the ice pilot, a wonderful guy called Freddie Lytham, Lightham rather. And he'd become a dear friend, and I was looking around thinking, where's Freddie? You know, this is his moment, you know, he's got to be here. But of course, he was the officer of the deck, you know, he was still in charge of the ship, and there we were, you know, at the middle of what Shackleton called the most, I forget the expression, the most dangerous part of the most dangerous sea on Earth. You know, we're surrounded by ice just trying to rip us apart, and you know, things like that. And he was in charge of the ship, but suddenly he was coming across the bridge towards me, and I remember he had his arm out, his hand out like that, and I met it with mine, and he said to me, "Mensun, how do you feel?" This is on record. I said to him, "You know, I feel the breath of Shackleton himself on the back of my neck, Freddie." We're running out of time, are we? Yeah, right.
Gosh, yes. I'm just one more question, but if you have questions from the floor, would you put your hands up now? Because the time is quickly. But so in terms of what you saw when you were looking.
Oh, well, you mean actually on the seabed?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Right, so day after we had the archaeological inspection dive, so we're seeing the ship for the first time in real time through cameras, and we approached from the stern, and I think everybody here has seen the image of the stern of the ship. So we're heading towards the stern. The first thing I see is the ship's rudder, and everybody here knows that the rudder was the source of all the problems. When the rudder was torn off, that was it. The water came pouring in, and the story, Chippy spent 2 days trying to stem the flow and stuff like that. And I kind of imagined that when the ice tore off the rudder, it carried the rudder away with it. I did not expect to see the rudder just laying there innocently beneath the top of the stern, right adjacent to the stern post. And on the stern post, you could see where the wood had been ripped away. You could see just under the mud, the gudgeons and the pimples. And then, of course, we came up over the stern, and that view of the stern, the word endurance arcing over the Polaris star, the original name the Norwegians had given her. She was Norwegian built, guys. And, that was just, again, just a mind-blowing moment. And then we went up over the taffrail. There was the ship's wheel, absolutely intact. The steering mechanism before it, and just above there was the companionway going down the accommodation deck. And you could see the pigeonholes there where all the flags were, and everybody remembers the picture of orderlies standing there in the companionway. You think of that straight away. Or the picture of Wordy in the film there, where he's swinging the wheel. I could see, it's just perfect. And there was that moment then where we sort of swerved a bit to one side, and there were the two portholes of Shackleton's cabin. Life just doesn't get better than that moment. Portholes of Shackleton's cabin. I could. We're running out of time here, but I could talk about the ice and the destruction and stuff.
Okay. Well, okay, we've got 3 or 4. So let's say we have 2 questions, maybe 3. Lady here, yourself? Yeah.
Thank you. That was brilliant. And as an archaeologist, I can really relate to the excitement. And just listening to you is just amazing. You could not excavate the wreck because it's in a protected area, and you mentioned that it's been surveyed and photographed and all this. Now, my question is about preservation.
Yeah.
So it's kind of 2 questions in one. Like, first of all, what is your opinion on the future of the wreck? Like, is it going to be preserved like it is, or like other wrecks like Titanic? Do you feel that it's going to degrade over time? And is there, second question then, is there going to be a monitoring of the wreck? Like, are you going to go back in, say, 10 years to assess the damage or lack of it?
Well, no, the Trust has absolutely no plans to do anything any further. The wreck was brilliantly preserved, as you saw. I mean, literally, I'm not exaggerating, I could see the paintwork on the ship. I could count the fastings and the plank work. It was, I've never ever in all my life, and I think I can say I've probably seen more shipwrecks than any other living maritime archaeologist, but nothing even remotely comparable, to the endurance. I mean, it's well known that there are no wood-consuming marine parasites in the Weddell Sea, no gribbleworm, no teredo. Teredo are those worms that enter the wood as a pinprick and then sort of turn into the grain, and then they're voracious. They just eat. I mean, teredos are to wooden ships, moths are to cardigans or death watch beetles to timber frame houses. They just consume everything. So it's a brilliant set of preservation. So the Trust has no plans to go back. We're getting on, most of the trustees. I got to pause, and I'm not saying this because our chairman happens to be in the audience, but I sort of pay tribute to, there's 4 of us trustees, I'm one, but I've got to mention Saul Peter Luger, who's this wonderful guy. He's a very successful Falkland Island businessman. A guy called Bill Featherington, who's he's a Falklands historian, but also a philatelist of huge note. And then we come to the chairman, the real giant within the Trust, Donald Lamont, who is a former, very, very successful and highly esteemed governor of the Falklands, who was also our man in Caracas and Montevideo. I think it was a bit of an old spook. I never asked him this to his face, but a bit of an old spook in Moscow and Berlin and things. And he bestrides everything. And Donald's sitting right beside my wonderful wife there in the middle distance. Yeah, right. But, Donald just drove this whole thing. As you can imagine, over the years, there were moments where we were all pretty beaten down about what to do next. But he was the one who just kept hammering away.
Sorry, could
Donald, you?
I add something to the answer?
Yeah.
Well, can I'm blushing, but I'll stop that. But it's really to respond to your concern about the future. Because the Foreign Office, first of all, there was a decision kind of in Berlin to put an exclusion zone. And I had a bit of a strop with the Foreign Office because they didn't ask us. And as a result of the strop, they have the Antarctic Heritage Trust has been commissioned to do a management plan. We are engaged in that. There is someone seconded from another organisation to give heritage expertise of a general sort. There was an initial sort of encounter, I think, online yesterday morning, of the group who will develop that plan over probably the next 2 years. I was able to tell Zan, as kind of earlier, that Camilla, the Chief Executive of the Antarctic Heritage Trust, and I agreed that the Shackleton family has to be closely involved from the beginning in the development of those plans. So that's, I think, there's going to be kind of something to take care of the sort of concerns.
I was just wondering, because obviously with global, climate change and all that, and the rise and like the changes in sea temperature and all this, I was wondering if that would be an impact on the wreck that, would be something considered. But like you said, management plan, that's what we need.
Right, we have a question over here.
Okay, right. I'm Jonathan Shackleton. No wonder if you brought so much excitement to so many people in the world. You've probably got itchy feet from all of this, and I'm wondering, for an expedition with parallel challenges, Northern Schultz expedition in the Antarctic, confusingly a ship named the Antarctic, surely that might be easier to find, and there are lots of echoes of Shackleton's trials and tribulations.
Yeah.
Have you thought of looking for that? I'm sure the court.
Well, we have talked about it, you're right. In fact, we were in discussion several years ago with colleagues in Sweden, asking them to look at the logbooks and things like that. There is a position for the Antarctic. I think, as I recall, it's about 40 miles, I think, to the south, as I recall, to the southeast of Paulet Island, or was it Robson? No, Paulet Island. And that is an area which is, yes, there's a lot of rogue ice around there, certainly, but it's not covered with ice in the way it was when that ship went down. So, yeah, but the water there is not so deep. And I kind of wonder whether the icebergs, when they're dragging their bums across the seabed, wouldn't go through that wreck site. I'm not sure. It's in that kind of interface zone where maybe not it was touched by the bergs. But it's an interesting one. Then there's the San Telmo on the other side of the peninsula as well. So yeah, work for archaeologists in the future.
So we'll take one more question.
Was the bell filmed or seen?
Sorry?
Was the bells filmed or seen? Is that it?
Yes.
Yeah, the bell question is quite interesting because I remember many years back there was a conference at the National Maritime Museum in which people were saying that she didn't carry a bell, which is nonsense. There's a reference in Shackleton's book and indeed the diaries. So we knew there was a bell there. The question is, where was it? It doesn't feature in any of Hurley's deck photographs. But if you go into the tween decks area and you look at the photographs of the Ritz, there is something there behind, hanging there from the beam. And if you look at it closely, it's kind of got the curves and the counter curves of a bell. And most people assume it's kind of like a light shade, because there's a light shade in front of it. But I'm convinced that is the bell. And when they went down to the Ritz, they took the bell with them. I don't know why. Maybe Charlie Green was bringing it when the meals are ready. I don't know. They'd gone off watches by that time. But we did find what looks to be the bell on the deck between the foremast and what is left of the forward wall, the forward bulkhead of the ship's galley. Now, we haven't processed all our photographs yet, by any means, and when we've done that, I'm hoping it'll be a lot more clearer, but there is something there at that point, which is the right size, and it appears to have the curves of the ship's bell. And if, for instance, Gaia's here, he'll confirm that the bell on the Fram is attached, if you think of the deck plan of the Endurance, it's right at the front of the bridge deck, and it would probably have been attached to the foremast. And I think it is there, but I'm an archaeologist by nature, I'm cautious. I don't want to go out on a limb and say it's definitely there, but it's looking good.
Okay, so I think we will, our fantastic interviewer Lorna, we're going to give her. Mensun Bound. I want to give Lorna one chance to ask, and I know there's lots of questions out there, and I'm really sorry, this could go on for hours, but I want to give Lorna a chance to ask maybe a question that she has had that she might want to ask Mensun.
Okay, so Mensun, I'm sure you dream, and if I know there's a preservation order and a plan, and the wreck won't be touched and everything, but if you were down around that ship, or you're one of those little worms that isn't there, what would you really like to see on the wreck?
Oh, Lorna, that's lovely. Yeah, I tell you what I'd really like to find is Volume 1 of Maitland's diaries. It's he was so broken up about not being able to save that, and I think Maitland's cabin, I know where it was, and I was looking down on it, but his actual cabin has been bulldozed towards the port side of the ship, and all his personal effects which he left behind, I'm afraid, have probably been lost. But who knows, there is a pile up of stuff there beside the light well through to the engine room. It could be that that his diary is there, because he wrote beautifully, and he just so lamented the fact that he'd lost that. The Bible his mother gave him, but also all his other little treasures were lost as well. So that's the thing.
Great. Yeah, so a genius idea, I think it was Joe's idea, that when you're all reading this book, maybe some of you have, weaving in the diaries and Shackleton's own account and South, and how he managed to master communication and control the narrative and all those things that are very interesting. That's all in here. It's a really gripping read, and Mensun will be signing copies just in here behind, just straight after that. And thank you all very much for coming, and thanks very much, Mensun, for being here.
Signed, you'll see there's a stand, and Harry McNish's daybook is on that, and it's open on the day where the rudder was ripped off the ship, so you can take a look at that. Before we finish, we have a small presentation from Mensun. It's a repoussé copper of the back of Endurance, and I just want to say to you that it's made by homeless people and migrants. The Mendicity Institute in Dublin, which is Ireland's oldest charity, run a bit like the Browning settlement, which I spoke about earlier. They run sort of rehabilitation work, occupational sort of therapy, and what they do is they do craft work. So this is a repoussé of Endurance, and the guy that made it just became totally engrossed in the story when we asked him to go and do it, and we just want to present that to you.